Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Millyard Museum for this great lecture, Manchester Fizz. Just a little bit of background. We are at the Millyard Museum, which is operated by the Manchester Historical Association. My name is Jeff Barraclough. I'm the executive director here. And just to tell you a little bit about our organization, I know many of you are members. We are a member-supported organization. We collect, preserve, and share Manchester's history, and we do that through this museum, through our research center on Amherst Street, which has a large collection of materials and historical resources about the city of Manchester that's open for people to come in and do research. We offer programs and lectures and tours throughout the year, such as this lecture here. The idea from this lecture comes from our current exhibit, All Bottled Up, that hopefully you have all had a chance to see. If you have not, please make sure you do so. It's all about the history of bottling in Manchester, and we feature over 200 bottles from over 50 different companies that have been Manchester bottlers. And Dennis Sasseville, who a pleasure for me to introduce, was a collaborator on that exhibit, really helped us provide some important information and do research on that, as well as some bottles that are on loan from him. And Dennis is really an expert in New Hampshire bottling. So today he's going to be giving us a great lecture on the history of bottling in Manchester, specifically surrounding soda and carbonated beverages in Manchester. So please help me welcome Dennis Sasseville.
Thank you, Jeff, and nice seeing all of you here, especially on a nice Saturday for a change. So hopefully you can get out after this and enjoy some of it. As Jeff said, the exhibit, if you haven't seen it, down the end of the hall, is definitely worth taking a look at. Jeff and Christy and Ashley have spent a lot of time putting that together. It's not just soda bottles; it's milk bottles, from all the dairies around. It's apothecary bottles, it's liquor bottles, things like that. So all kinds of things to look at today. But today we're going to talk about a couple of Manchester stories with regard to carbonated soda, especially. And first, I always like to point out, what are some of the tools available when you're trying to do some of this historic research? And I'm not a history major by training. I'm a scientist, but using some of my research background and research orientation, turning it toward more popular history, especially in retirement. So certainly city directories here at the MHA, town histories, legal records. A lot of these bottling companies ended up going to court over one thing or another, copyright issues or territory issues. Vintage advertising obviously is key, because that usually gives you dates and it gives you what products that company was selling. So either in newspapers or city directories have great advertising as well, which again helps date and provide some sort of place and provenance to some of these companies. Surviving bottles and closures, caps and so on. God bless bottle collectors out there. There are some really nutty bottle collectors out there who kind of go overboard, but thank goodness they do. I belong to a couple of national bottling associations, and they're actually can be very helpful many times when you're trying to track down the history of the company that created the bottle or created the contents that go into a bottle. And even bottle caps. There's a whole group of people out there that collect bottle caps. These are adults now, not kids. And so there's online databases of bottle caps sorted by city, by state, by type of drink, and certainly name. So, God bless them. They've been very helpful. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have oral history or some family histories, especially where we're talking about a lot of these smaller bottling companies were family-run, family-owned, and some of them didn't last all that many years. So, unfortunately, there's not much in the way of family history that's very reliable. Families just didn't, after the company folded or the family moved on to a different type of business, they didn't seem to keep records, or at least they didn't pass them on to the historical society. So they're sometimes hard to come by. So all too often, not too much is available. You're piecing together various bits of information. So we're talking about carbonated sodas. Most of the country calls this beverage a soda, right? Pop, especially in the Midwest, or soda pop. Maybe some of you grew up with that. In some parts of the country, it's just simply called a soft drink, non-differentiated. Southerners, including some still these days, call all carbonated sodas Coca-Cola. So it's like, well, what flavor of Coca-Cola do you want with your lunch today? It's like, okay. And of course, here in New England, there are still some enclaves that call it Tonic, right? As harkening back to the days of patent medicines. We'll talk about that. Mostly, it's kind of central Massachusetts, Worcester, parts of Boston, maybe northern Hampshire and parts of northern Maine, or just us individuals scattered around the countryside call it Tonic. Maybe some of you call your favorite beverage something else, and we can talk about that or share that maybe at the end. I'll allow plenty of time for questions. So fizzy soda has just a long history in this country since 1825, when kind of soda really got to start with Schweppes and some others. There's something like 30,000 different soft drink bottlers operated in the U.S. alone. That's just an amazing number. Producing something like 16,000 different brands. We're not talking about flavors. We're talking about 16 different named brands of soda. Some of them very short-lived. So how many are still around today? Well, very, very few is part of the story here. So it all starts with water, whether you're talking about soda, beer, milk, soup, whatever. The recognition is that an awful lot of what goes into these products is just kind of pure, water. Whoops, Christy? Pure water of some sort or another. I don't know if I touched the...
I don't think it has, it should.
Go back one. Okay, yeah, all right. I was just going to show, this is Massabesic up here, obviously our water supply. And this is Cohos Springs, of which there's part of an exhibit here with the bottle exhibit. Really interesting. This is just, technically it wasn't in Manchester, it was in Londonderry, North Londonderry, just south of the airport. But it was on the trolley line from Derry up to Goss Falls, and then up to Manchester. So, like a lot of, we're really not talking too much about spring water, this morning, but like a lot of these places, it was a destination, as it were. There was, you could tour the place, you could tour where the springs were, you could take nature walks, and so on and so forth. So, one way or the other, it all starts with water. It also starts with kind of our history, especially in this country and in England and Europe, of kind of the golden age of patent medicines. I give a whole kind of talk on patent medicines of New England, but just as a little bit of a nutshell here, they have the origin of a lot of our sodas today and popular soft drinks really come from the patent medicine era. And I'll just say a couple of words about this. Is that we think of that whole era, especially in the 1800s, of just an era of quackery where people were fooled and they spent money buying all these different remedies and things like that. How foolish could our ancestors be? We're so much smarter today, right? And well, maybe not. Part of the story is that even the Shakers had a line of patent medicines, as honest and good people as they were. So it was part of that era. We should say patent medicines are kind of a little bit of a misnomer. Most of these medicines of the 1800s especially weren't patented. They were really proprietary medicines is a better term. In other words, they were proprietary to that particular company. And I put things in the context of, in that era, there was a great mistrust of physicians and doctors. Many were poorly trained. The working poor couldn't always afford physicians. There was things like the still remnants of the heroic medicine era of bloodletting and things like that. And in the developing United States of 1800s, there was only 4 true medical schools that you could receive any formal training. One was Harvard, of course, Dartmouth up here in our North Country, Columbia in New York, and the College of Philadelphia, which later became the University of Pennsylvania. Diplomas were issued for 2 years of study, and many physicians learned their trade primarily by serving as an apprentice to individuals who were also poorly trained. That's great. Those wishing a more thorough medical training typically sought that from Europe, London, Edinburgh, or Paris, assuming they could afford the education over there in the first place. With the rapidly mushrooming American population, the typical local physician of his time was not necessarily a qualified, board-certified practitioner, and many, quote, doctors simply adopted that title because it benefited them and their enterprise. So as late as 1870, the head of Harvard's medical school reported that written examination could not be given to medical students because not enough of them could write well enough. Again, really encouraging. So some would say that, an ailing patient probably had a better chance of recovery by not seeing the local physician. So I think we need to give a little bit more credit to our ancestors from the 1800s and so on. There was a lot of quackery, and we talked a little bit about that, but there was a lot of other things going on, as well. This is also an era in the 1800s of where just food adulteration occurred in Europe, as well, was just rampant. We're just not talking about beverages. We're talking about bakers putting plaster of Paris in bread so they didn't have to use as much flour. It was absolutely rampant. And kind of what led to sort of some of the relief for us poor consumers? Well, it certainly came about by kind of a long series of changes, and there were some writers and those who would champion kind of the cause of the pure food movement. And in 1905 to 1906, Collier's Weekly, which is a pretty prominent publication of its day, had an 11-part series called The Great American Fraud by Samuel Hopkins Adams. And he was really kind of pulling away the covers from all this food adulteration, the quackery medicine, and so on. That began to change people's attitudes. We also had this fellow named Harvey W. Wiley, who was the first commissioner of the fledgling Food and Drug Administration. So as the federal government kind of got its act together to protect us consumers, he was a champion of that and a leader. He was a food chemist, and he was adamant about protecting that. And he had his friend in the White House, good old Teddy Roosevelt here. So in 1906, they got around to passing the first Pure Food and Drug Act. And it really kind of did change the landscape. Even though it didn't have a lot of teeth in it, it was more of an act that kind of prohibited false advertising. But that still had the effect upon manufacturers of them sort of changing their tune, that along with the fact they saw where the public sentiment was going at the time. And so things began to change. As an example, in the Manchester City Directory shows that in 1905 there were something like 12 drug manufacturers in the city. 3 years after the passage of this act, or 2 years after the passage of this act in 1908, there were only 4. So that's kind of an indication of where the landscape was changing and where the public sentiment was changing, and the consumers going along with that. So, I always ask the question when we talk about sodas, is it a beverage or is it a medicine? Well, there was an era when it was a little bit of both, really. And this first ad here on the left for Barry's Root Beer, which is a Manchester product, the Union, which became the Union leader, of course, July 1902, talked about it, and can prevent sunstroke can be prevented by keeping the blood cool. Acts on purifying the blood, cools and purifies it, and cures thirst. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but when you think about it, what do we do on a hot Saturday after we mow the lawn? We run for a cold drink, whether it's a beer or whether it's root beer or iced tea or something else. So there's certainly some truth in that. And then, the famous Coca-Cola, claimed that, it could cure headaches. Well, caffeine does have that effect. A lot of people take a caffeinated drink if they have a mild headache. Coca-Cola had other issues with regard to cocaine, as we know, but certainly the caffeine angle was pretty accurate. And then you had people like Dr. Pepper, which was formed just a couple of months after Moxie was formed, invented in 1885, very popular in the South, of course. And free from caffeine and cocaine. Well, that's always good to know, free from cocaine, that's great. But also points out that they're compliant with the Food and Drug Act. So again, the consumer public was really getting aware of all this. And then you have one of our favorites, Moxie, which we always like to talk about, and I have to interject. And we'll talk a little bit about them in a second. But they started off as a Moxie Nerve food, not so much as a tonic. And so they did, 1885, they did differentiate themselves. Moxie never had, originally did not have caffeine. It never had cocaine or anything bad like that. It never had alcohol, as a lot of the remedies, did. It really was thought of as a food type product, and it was kind of pitched that way. Even though there's some outlandish claims the first 10, 20 years of its existence, whatever, those got sort of tamped down, especially by the Food and Drug Act. But it was a food, and it talked about sort of dosing yourself with a glass maybe 4 times a day. Dr. Pepper did the same thing. You should have it at 10, 2, and 4, or whatever their slogan was for a while. And all this was created by a physician, Dr. Augustine Thompson of Lowell. He's a Maine resident from Union, Maine, who was a homeopathic physician, a Civil War veteran, an outstanding fellow, and had a very active, thriving practice in the city of Lowell. Lowell at that time was really the center of a lot of patent medicines, especially with Hood's sarsaparilla, and those kinds of beverages, and air, drug, and many others. So it's speculated that maybe he was attracted to set up his practice in Lowell because of that, because a lot of physicians at the time did have their own remedies that they gave to their patients. And there's some indication that Thompson may have done that. Even before he launched Moxie in 1885. We really don't have any proof of that, and unfortunately, no one can find any of Thompson's medical records. The family didn't seem to keep them, and even though he was in practice for quite a few decades, so it's a little bit hard to determine. But as I said, many physicians did have their own formulas during that era. And of course, Moxie had a secret ingredient, as a lot of them did. And at first couple of decades, it really was secret about this and had some outlandish claims. But eventually they just sort of embraced it. And it's gentian root. And gentian is really, it was known before Moxie was created. It was used, you can find recipe books and formula books from the earlier 1800s where gentian is a component. It's a flowering plant, as you can tell. It's produced commercially in Spain and parts of France. So probably, the Moxie company purchased, gentian material from overseas. And then they had a chemist, the chief chemist was named James Penny, and he was with the company from the late 1800s to about the 1940s. And this is a copy of his laboratory notebook. And so, we know some of the formulas for something like Moxie, in part because of this notebook. And this notebook is, we have this today in part because of the efforts of my co-author here, Merrill Lewis, sitting in the back of the room. It was given to him, and it now resides in the Matthew Museum of Maine Heritage in Union, Maine, which was the birthplace of Augustine Thompson. They have a Moxie wing, and they have all kinds of Moxie memorabilia and records there. And so you can actually see how gentian root was extracted and used in the process. And you see other formulas there for Moxie's root beer, ginger ale, and so on and so forth like that. So yeah, there were secret ingredients, but eventually they kind of came to light. And many of them weren't all that, all that other than the ones that were harmful, like heroin or cocaine or alcohol. A lot of them, were just sort of a variation of a home remedy, perhaps, that had been used for eons by families. And that's quite common when you do this kind of research as well. And today you can find, gentian in all kinds of things. It's really an ingredient of bitters, and there's all kinds of commercial bitters on the market, just on your store shelves. And Angostura bitters is well known. It's mostly gentian root. So I always tell people, Moxie is really a root beer formula, with a kicker, and the kicker is gentian. And so you could take a root beer and you can sprinkle in a couple of drops of your bitters, and you have something pretty close to Moxie if you want to make it yourself at home. So, so much for deep secrets. Moxie was sold far and wide. This is actually Post Office Square in Boston. And Moxie was a little bit different than many beverages of its day, including Dr. Pepper and Coca-Cola and even Hires, in that they were really suspicious of just selling syrup to the apothecaries, to the soda fountains, and having the fellows there do things right. And in part because Moxie tastes, because it has a bit of a bitter aftertaste to it, it tastes best when it's ice cold. and when it's highly carbonated. And they just didn't trust these teenage soda jerks, at the apothecaries to do it right. So the preference was to put it in bottles, we call them quart bottles, or actually like 27 ounces or something, and to dispense them cold from the bottle. So here's a bottle wagon that's actually a dispensary. So you go up, and for a nickel, this nice gentleman will pour you a 5-cent glass, of Moxie. Others, as I said, were quite different. Coca-Cola and others were very much into being syrup makers, and they didn't really care for bottling at first, for the first couple decades. Coke was actually kind of dragged, not kicking and screaming, but it really was the impetus of several of its contract bottlers, or contract people that bought their syrup. That started bottling it in the South, that really kind of caught on. And they said, "Oh, yeah, I guess we could bottle this stuff," So it's amazing how giant companies sort of had some of their origin. So this advertisement, which probably is in New England, I think this is from the South. Coca-Cola at our fountains. That was how beverages, especially carbonated beverages, were often quite pushed. There's a whole history of bottles in this country. This is from Corning Museum, excuse me, in New York, and just sort of the indication of just how valuable bottles were in early American colonial America, because everything was in bottles. I mean, you could get, right, your pickles came in bottles, right, as well as your medicines and beverages and liquor and so on and so forth. Moxie story, which I'm only touching upon now. If you're kind of interested in Moxie, I'm going to be giving a talk in September at the Goffstown Public Library, Tuesday evening, I think it is, September 9th, just on Moxie and the history of Moxie. But the interesting role Moxie had was that because it was so highly carbonated, bottles of the day weren't strong enough to contain it. In fact, they probably used champagne bottles probably specifically initially. But when they went to contract and kind of brand their beverage, they had a problem with getting strong enough bottles of the day, because bottles, for the most part, were still quite hand-blown and certainly hand-finished at the top. Moxie did find a willing participant in Lineborough Glass Company over here in Lineborough, New Hampshire, because their glass was particularly strong, because their source was a quartzite vein of rock that they tapped into, and they purified it further. It made their glass quite strong. So actually they produced some of the first Moxie bottles in this country. Unfortunately, the glass manufacture wasn't too long for this world, as many New Englanders weren't, because they were outcompeted by coal-fired glass kilns in the Mid-Atlantic states, especially New Jersey and Ohio and so on. But the Lineborough glass imparts sort of a bluish tint to it. This photograph is probably a little bit of an exaggeration. This isn't your photograph, is it, Merrill?
One like it.
It wasn't like it. So this might not be quite as blue as it shows in this photograph, but they do have a definite bluish tint. So Moxie had a mark on the bottling world, not just the beverage world. And of course, they were great advertisers, and started went from the horse and buggy stage to having to adopting the automobile once it started. They had novelty things such as the horsemobiles, which they put on in this case, a LaSalle chassis. They had about 20 some of these at one time or another. This is the only surviving original Moxie horsemobile, and this is at Clark's Bears up in Lincoln. He purchased it. I think it's still up there. I don't think it's been sold. There are replicas around, but mostly the auto clubs and museums have sort of grabbed them up, so they don't even show up in parades anymore as they used to 10, 20 years ago. Moxie also used celebrities quite extensively, Ed Wynn and other popular celebrities of the 20s and 30s. And then, of course, they also had novelties such as this Moxie bottle, Moxie bottle beverage stand. And this is from Pine Island Park. If you were here for Ed Bruder's talk on Pine Island Park a couple of months ago, he showed this photo. And this was used just as the Moxie wagons were to dispense. We have this, I don't know if you can see it in this black and white, but this handsome attendant here. We call him Clyde. I don't know why. And this bevy of women all lined up to get their 5-cent bottles of Moxie from Clyde. And of course, the history of this bottle, as Merrill has given many talks on, including here, is that it became part. And there's some photos in the exhibit. I encourage you to look at of both this bottle and what it became as part of a cottage, a summer cottage on the shores of Pine Island Pond, just a stone's throw from where Merrill Lewis, now lives. It's now been restored, again, in large part because of the efforts of Merrill and others, and it resides at the Moxie Museum in Union, Maine, and definitely worth seeing if you're up in that area. It's a little bit off the beaten track, north of Damariscotta and Booth Bay Harbor, but it's not too far off the track, and it's definitely worth it in July and August, or if you go to the Union Agricultural Fair, which is, a very big thing. All right, so apothecaries did have their role in all of this. This is Thurston's Drug Store on Elm Street in Manchester. I think we have some of Thurston's bottles or signage out here in the display. This is about 1900, and what you see is that you don't see any soda fountain here. Those were just sort of developing as apothecaries found another way of selling to the public. And but as an example, this is the listing of apothecaries in Manchester in. What do I have? 1908. There's 42 apothecaries in Manchester alone. Manchester wasn't that big in 1908, and yet as an indication of where people got their medicines, their drugs, their sundry items, and so on. So it was certainly a thriving business sector, in our city. And then it's hard to kind of talk about some of this without at least talking a little bit about the whole temperance movement. It was well established in states well before national prohibition in 1920. I don't think I've seen a temperance directory in Manchester city directories, but I can't say that I've always looked for it. But this example is from Lowell in 1891. These are all the temperance societies and associations in the city of Lowell. Again, Lowell wasn't that big either. In the 1800s. So it gives you an indication of what the public sentiment was and where things were moving at the time. Prohibition was actually pretty popular, including in New Hampshire, well before 1920. It was started strong in our state before the Civil War. The Civil War interrupted quite a bit, but it got reestablished after the Civil War with Congressman Henry Blair of New Hampshire introduced a prohibition amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It was the first time that such an amendment had ever been introduced. And as a senator, he again introduced another prohibition resolution in 1885. That also failed. But early in the 20th century, New Hampshire passed a local option law. It permitted localities to decide whether or not to have their own prohibition, and many did. So, as we know, even in Massachusetts and other places where I grew up, partly, different counties were dry or different towns were dry, and that still continues, today. So it was quite a factor. I use this as an example. This is Sunapee Harbor, actually. And this store building is actually still there today. It's a restaurant. My wife and I have eaten there. It's right on the shores of Sunapee Harbor, as you can tell. And what I use this as an illustration for is that it's a little bit hard to see in the black and white, but there's all kinds of signage here about the things the store offers. But what's the largest, piece of signage on this store? It's, ice cold temperance drinks. That was the calling card. So it was a pretty big movement and had a lot of effect, even before, again, national prohibition kind of took hold. So soda fountains became sort of a safe space as this whole movement of anti-alcohol movement started, and certainly during the years of prohibition from 1920 to 1933, and nationally, they became a much bigger force. They were really a social gathering spot. And so Manchester, we've got pharmacies that adopted the soda fountain, Walsh and Cummings Pharmacy. I think there's a different picture of this in the exhibit, Walsh and Cummings Pharmacy. There's an earlier picture, but this is 1932. And aside from all the fountains and all the nice attendants you see, also at the end here, you probably can't make it out, but there's a nice little Moxie display, so they're plugging Moxie to their patrons. Squag Fruit in Granite Square was there from, this is 1940s, it was there I think till 1983 when urban renewal occurred, and we widened Granite Square and tore down some things. I don't see any Coca-Cola or Moxie signs, but there's kind of a kissed beverage novelty mirror over there, whatever. And then even corner stores got involved, and this is Lucille's Variety and on Burke Street, and this is provided to me by Susan Bennett Bird, sitting here in the audience, and this is Susan's parents in 1946, Joe and Rita, I believe right after they were married, and what I use this photo for is to show the Coca-Cola cooler. Coke wasn't the only one to kind of figure out that once they got onto bottling and really got into the bottling business, they went whole hog on having these coolers at gas stations and all kinds of places. They certainly weren't the only ones. Moxie and Pepsi and others had their coolers, but Coke was really aggressive. But also in this photo, there's a Moxie advertisement up here as well. So Moxie was still quite popular in these parts, and has always remained so. All right, looking at some of the New Hampshire operations. Again, this picture I think is also in the exhibit. This is Manchester Tonic Company, which operated at least from 1924 to 1938. It may have lasted into the 50s. It sort of went under an earlier name of Marne River Bottling Company in 1919. And they not only had their own brand of sodas, but they also had Squeeze, which is a brand from the Berkshire region. So this is quite common, especially for smaller, kind of the mom and pop operations. They might have their own flavors that they bottled, that they certainly pushed, because they made the most profit over those. But they also carried some name brands, if not Coca-Cola, in this case, a regional brand called Squeeze. This photo on the right is Coca-Cola in Salem, and obviously these modern delivery vehicles here in the 1920s. It was really started by two brothers who bought the Haverhill Coca-Cola bottling plant in 1919, and then 2 years later decided, well, those New Hampshire people, they need Coke too. So they moved it up across the border in Salem Depot, and it became sort of the anchor for New Hampshire for Coke products for a number of years. In fact, as some of the illustrations in the exhibit show, even when Coca-Cola operated in Manchester, they called themselves the Salem Coca-Cola Bottling Company for a long time. So at one point, as best I can tell from my research, there were at least 200 different New Hampshire bottlers representing over 60 of our different cities and communities, that have been around since the 1800s. That's quite a bit for our size state. And then, many of them are represented in the exhibit, so I certainly encourage you to spend some time and take a look at that. Curran Brothers, Manchester Tonic we just talked about, which also went under another name, Rock Springs, which we'll talk about in a second, and then certainly Cott and Lafayette. And again, we know a lot of what the situation is there, based upon the advertising that we see. This is Leary and Company, and again, they have kind of their own beverages line. I think this is their own beverage line, Sterling Beverages. I've never seen a Sterling bottle, I don't think, unless the museum here has one. But they also offered New Grape and Orange Crust, which were national brands as well. So this is very common. Also, many bottlers, as you can see from the exhibit and can tell from the exhibit, a lot of bottlers in Manchester especially, they would bottle anything. They'd bottle both liquor, beer, and soft drinks. And that was especially true, of course, during national prohibition when bottling alcohol was illegal. But even before then, that was always just a tradition. And you made your money kind of being a distributor of bottled beverages. Curran Brothers, again, who has some information here in the exhibit. This is just an example of an ad for Herbo, which was kind of a Moxie knockoff or a Moxie competitor. I think they even went to court over this. So that's a whole nother story. And then Derby Beverages, Derby Club, which was our own brand, King Orange, and I think we have a bottle example of that here in the exhibit. So we could be here a couple of hours just talking about all the different small, bottlers and the evidence that we have if we had time. But one story today is Lafayette Beverages of Derry. There's a Crystal Springs in Derry, and this spring house is pretty elaborate. It's one of the during its latter days. Originally, it was just sort of a trickle in some farmer's field. That they said, hey, this is good stuff, and we should bottle that. It's off of Old Wyndham Road in Derry, and Derry at that time was really called Nutfield. That's why the brand kind of used the Nutfield. And many of you may know that, from 1719, parts of Derry, Hampstead, Wyndham, Londonderry, and Manchester were all part of what was called Nutfield at that time. I guess it was called Nutfield because of the abundance of oaks, chestnuts, and other similar nut trees. But the claim to fame here is that the Marquis de Lafayette, who were celebrating the anniversary of his coming to New Hampshire, it was 1824, 1825. In fact, I think there's a thing to do up in Concord today, as a matter of fact, right? To honor him. So he was obviously a Revolutionary War hero. Americans loved him. He came back in the 1800s to give a tour and visit the U.S. And yes, he went to Concord and other parts of our state, but he went to Derry as well. And as the story goes, that he was given some of this Crystal Springs water, and he liked it so much that he had 2 barrels shipped to his hotel in Boston that he was staying at. And so I think the owners decided to change the name of the Crystal Springs to Lafayette Springs, and it quickly became Lafayette Mineral Springs, became kind of their trademark. And it kind of went on from there. It went through several different business owner changes, but it was eventually sold to a group of investors that included Frederick Shepherd, who was a prominent businessman in Derry. Name may sound familiar. He was, in fact, the grandfather of Alan B. Shepherd, our first astronaut. So there's quite a bit of history in Derry to talk about there. But the company failed in the early 1920s, and Crystal Springs itself was kind of abandoned or kind of left by the wayside, not really used. Somewhere in the 80s or 90s, whatever, I think it got bulldozed, and now it's a housing development. You can't even see the springs, anymore. But there was a fellow named Allard LeMay who purchased the bottling company and moved it to Manchester, and he did that in part because he was French Canadian, and he said, "Well, there's just not enough French Canadians here in Derry. There's a lot there in Manchester. I'm going to move my business to Manchester and serve the French Canadian population." That was his pitch, and he did that. But he only kept it in Manchester for a couple of years, or only kept his ownership of the business for a couple of years, and he sold it to Antonio Jolicoeur. So on April 1st, 1926, a baker delivery driver named Antonio Jolicoeur bought the bottling plant with $500 down and borrowed on a life insurance policy and 16 years worth of monthly payments for a grand total sum of like $3,800. This transition left Jolicoeur, a man with a young and growing family to support, with 43 cents, a small inventory of beverages, and an unfailing desire to succeed, in this new venture. So he was not a man to kind of let grass grow under his feet, and had no intention of failing in this new business venture. One of his very first sales was to a Pearl Street variety store operated by his former boarding house landlady, whom he knew had a penchant for purchasing goods for her shelves in cash. Cash is king, right? So Jolicoeur made a cash sale and never looked back from there, even when the typically challenges of a retail business rose to test his resolve. He had been in business only 6 months when beverage companies came under regulation by the State Department of Health here in New Hampshire, and he was ordered to install a new bottle washer at a cost of $2,600, funds he did not have at the time. But unthwarted, Jolicoeur somehow talked the liquid carbonic company into providing him with one of their washers on a 3-year note. Crisis averted. And this is him in 1931 at his bottling plant. One of the ginger ale and quart bottles was one of his specialties, and that's the founder Antonio Jolicoeur right there in the straw hat. In 1936, he decided to join forces with Pepsi in a marriage that even he thought wouldn't really work or pan out. Pepsi had only really been formed in the teens or 1920s, so unlike Coke, it hadn't been around all that long. So he wasn't really sure of the brand. But he was so pessimistic about the business collaboration that at first he refused to purchase a $315 unit of concentrate from Pepsi in order to bottle the beverage. So what did he do? Instead, he purchased 100 cases of already bottled Pepsi from a Lynn, Massachusetts bottler to first test the waters here in Manchester to see if they liked it, if his customer base liked it. Only after determining that his clientele really did like this new cola drink, did he commit to purchasing a full unit of the concentrate himself. So not too shabby a businessman from that regard. But he wouldn't spend the extra $15 for a labeling attachment to accommodate the new 12-ounce bottles that Pepsi required. Well, that's what his 11-year-old sons were for, and so Robert Jolicoeur was pressed into service with labels, a quart jar of glue, and a brush, and that's how he got the job done. This is when it was at the Wilson Street facility location. Went from Harvard Street to Wilson Street to Massapequa Street. The customer base was quite dispersed at the time for these local small bottlers. Really, it was a mom and pop grocery stores. You sold to your corner grocery store and so on. What changed the whole landscape for them and for many manufacturers and retailers, was the growth of supermarkets, especially after World War II. So once supermarkets came in with their kind of volume buying and their command of shelf space, who can have what shelf space, that really changed it for the small bottlers of Manchester and just about everywhere else. And not just bottlers, but no matter what you were selling, if you were just selling it, making it and selling it to the local store, a local corner store, you were having some problems. So the whole buying power of supermarkets kind of changed the whole landscape. This is the Lafayette Fleet, probably at about 1940. This might be at Massapequa Street. I'm not sure. It looks like the back area. But the Pepsi connection, as I said, started in 1936 and kind of grew from there. This is when they did move to Massapequa Street, and they were there from about 1941 through the 60s, and certainly to some extent into the 80s. One thing about this facility is that it had picture windows in the front, and so passersby could stand there and watch the bottling going on. And that was part of the attraction as well. So if you've ever been to a bottling plant or, even to a candy store that's making things in front of you, it's always fun to see how things are made. Many of the, again, like any true bottler, they had both their own line, Lafayette Ginger Ale here, but they also at various times bottled all these other brands, including even Schweppes. And as I said, eventually became sort of a Pepsi distributor. But they were a very big bottler of Moxie. They and Cochico over on the seacoast in Rochester area were two of the biggest bottlers of Moxie in our state. Others did it, but they were big. They also had brands like the Lemmy Lemonade, which was very popular. In fact, when Schweppes back started bottling a flavored tonic or flavored sodas. What they called aerated lemonade, carbonated lemonade, was one of the first beverages. So it's an old beverage from that regard. The other story, is I should just say in terms of the Jolicoeur family, they sold their operations to Pepsi in 1986. Excuse me. Pepsi production had already moved into Massachusetts with some modern plants in central Massachusetts at that time. And the Dr. Pepper and Moxie accounts couldn't stay with Pepsi. That was a conflict, so they got spun off to Coca-Cola. So that's why Coke is a bottler of Moxie, even today. Lafayette, and then we moved to Cott Beverages, which was another kind of giant here in the Manchester area. Similar to Lafayette, they had a long, and complex history here in New Hampshire. They were established in 1923 in Port Chester, New York, by Polish immigrant Solomon Cott. And One of their kind of claims to fame was Diet Cola, which called Metricola, and it was actually developed by Johnson & Johnson for diabetics, and became one of Cott's biggest product areas. There's also a connection to the Lakes region in that a Montreal Canadian named Henry Penser in 1952 sent 3 of his sons to summer camp in Lake Winnipesaukee area. And those sons developed a love of Cott soda. Cott was really known for being very flavorful, having a lot of juice, added, a lot of very sparkling flavors. So Pence was so impressed that his sons were kind of crazy over the soda that he brought the franchise into Canada, and actually it lasted in Canada longer than it even lasted here. So in Manchester, Cott was bottled by the Silver Brothers, famous name. They started off as grocers in the 1920s here in Manchester. And as you can tell from this ad from the city directory, they both had their alcoholic line of products, but then they also had the Cott line, and they were pretty much pressing both of those onto the public. Like a lot of bottlers and other retailers, they had all kinds of giveaways. Here's a little calendar, baby calendar, whatever, and they had a very good price. 5 cents was in the 1940s, 50s was a good price for a bottle of soda. They also had quite a variety of you see some of the different advertisements out here in the exhibit. Some say 14 flavors, 15 flavors. Some ads were 17 or 18, so it varied over the years. But they had quite a bit of traditional flavors, but also some really unusual ones: sparkling coffee, apple ginger, cherry cola, of which I think there's an example here in the exhibit, and the low-calorie dietetic line was very, very popular. So Cott was a and if you're from Manchester, you probably remember the plant and remember the operation. It was in the Millyard. It took up a space at 8 Mills South, what was called Mill South, the old textile mill, which is kind of between the old Pandora, right, and Founders Restaurant now. It was torn down in the 1970s through again, urban renewal, but also, as the Millyard developed, we needed space for parking, because when the Millyard was developed, people didn't have cars, and certainly there wasn't any thought that not only would cars come around and be something on the scene, but that everyone would be driving to work and so on. So this was one of the buildings that kind of got torn down. I think there was the actual address was 177 Granite Street before Granite Street got widened. And I guess we have a question here at the MHA as to whether or not there was a retail store off of Granite Street. There's a video on the wall in the exhibit that shows Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts visiting the plant and getting a tour of the plant and going in sort of a fabricated, metal fabricated, entryway into the offices. I guess what we're not sure as to whether or not there was also a retail store there where the public could just go in and buy. Some of you may know or may have something to share as we come to an end here. But so as with any history, we always have some gaps we're trying to kind of fill in. So the Silver Brothers vacated the mill in 1976, and it was torn down shortly thereafter. And some of the former locations that we have around town, we have Willow Street. So this is not South Willow. This is Willow. So this is like the back of that stretch. And we had Queen City Bottling Works operated out of here. We know that. This is. This is Chestnut Street, and at the other end of this, out of the picture, was where we used to have the post office luncheonette, which I think was just highlighted on Facebook here. So this was Rock Springs, or Dan Dowse, or Bola. Bola was also another competitor for a while of Moxie, and Moxie took them to court. It's hard to tell. We don't have leasing records in terms of whether or not they took the whole of this space from the time they operated there, which was 1906 to 1927. Again, there's always kind of gaps in our information. This is Massabesic Street, where very much changed, very modern building now. The picture windows are gone and so on from Lafayette Beverages, but it's still a very active industrial building today. And this is, what did I say? This is Wilson Street? Harvard Street. I think this became a bakery. I don't know that.
That was Jeunesse Bakery.
Okay, all right. So I think the bottling plant operated in just this small building here before they did move to Harvard Street, or to Wilson Street, excuse me. But again, it's a little bit hard to know from records. Then we have on South Willow, we have the old Coca-Cola plant. So when they became part of the whole Coca-Cola empire. This is not kind of a typical architecture for a lot of Coca-Cola plants around the country, other than it has the combination of the brick and the concrete. But some of them are a little bit more kind of classical looking than what we have. Of course, now it's been repurposed to all kinds of other things, such as auto parts store. And then this is 550 Elm Street. This building is right across from the SNU Arena, where I guess Fish is playing all this week, so they've blocked off that. My oldest granddaughter here just finished an art class, here in this building, but this was used for a number of years by William Glancy, and I believe by his brother Thomas F. Glancy, who may have had part of the building. And it's not clear to me, again, from the records, whether William Glancy did the soft drinks and Tom did some of the harder liquor or not. But there's some information here in the exhibit. And then this is Wilson Street, where Lafayette operated. And if you remember the building with the nice cement columns, this is just a little remnant of what's left of that great architecture. The building's in pretty sorry state, as you can see, which is not atypical. So modern times, what's kind of the story about modern times? Well, most soft drink bottlers who were around, including those in Manchester, are no more. The smaller family kind of based operations just couldn't compete. They just got out-competed. So medium-sized operations did merge, and we see that in some of the records, corporate records and directories. Or they were incorporated into national brands. So that was kind of Lafayette's story. Cott just sort of did get incorporated and became actually, I think, a Tampa, Florida firm or something like that, but they had stopped bottling at that point. They were just really a brand name, just like Pan American or some of the other brand names that people have tried to resurrect. So there's really two survivors in the greater Manchester area that kind of worth talking about. One is called Private Label Specialties. They're over in Goffstown. They actually started in Bedford. A fellow named Ray Duhame founded it in 1991, and he started bottling sparkling water, and then he quickly kind of added flavored drinks and so on. And his claim to fame is that he will custom, as the name of his company indicates, he will custom label any kind of brand of soda, any kind of flavor of soda for you that you can sell in your restaurant, convenience store. I've even known that like alumni associations sometimes when they have a reunion will get a root beer with a special label made. You can even if you have a birthday party for your favorite niece or something like that, and you want to have Sally's root beer, whatever, they'll do that. So I've asked Ray what his favorite flavor is, because he has probably more than a dozen and a half, and what his customers are, and he said the answer is both. Root beer. Root beer remains, just a popular flavor for everyone all around. And then, of course, the other big giant in town is Coca-Cola Northeast in Londonderry. So all the Coke plants, eventually consolidated and were kind of purchased. This isn't owned by Coca-Cola Atlanta, the big parent company. Most of the bottling these days for Coke around the country is franchised, and it's always been here in New Hampshire. And so this Coca-Cola franchise is actually owned by Kirin Holdings, which is a Japanese firm. You may know Kirin Beer. And they've been an owner since 1977, when they wanted to get into the soft drink market here in the U.S. But it's a fairly large operation. It expanded greatly in territory in 2018, It's still headquartered in Bedford, but they have like 700 New Hampshire employees and 3,400 employees in their whole territory of the Northeast. A very modern facility. If you ever get a chance, they don't give public tours, but if you're part of a group or an association that's lucky enough to get a tour, you want to go on it. It's really impressive operation to see in its efficiency and speed. Interestingly, they do bottle Moxie. So in before their expansion in 2007, they actually purchased the Moxie brand from what was then Monarch New Grape in Atlanta. It had left New England to become an Atlanta, based brand. They bought it back. So from between 2007 until 2018, the head of Moxie in this country was in Bedford, New Hampshire. But then with their expansion and their closer affiliation with Coke, they decided to spin off the brand and they sold it to the parent company. So ironically, Moxie brand is now owned by Coca-Cola Atlanta, the big competitor. Obviously, Coke sells a lot more Coke and Diet Coke than they sell something like Moxie, but they've kept it as a loyal brand. So if you see this, and pretty much it's just bottled in cans by Londonderry now, but if you find it in Shaw's or Hannaford or Market Basket or any of those stores, and you can, it's been bottled here in Londonderry. There's two contract franchise operators that do bottle Moxie in glass bottles with cane sugar, right, which is a thing that some people really like. One is in Pennsylvania, and the other is way out on the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest. But if you buy a bottle of Moxie, glass bottle of Moxie in Cracker Barrel or one of those places, it's made either in near Seattle, Washington, or sort of central Pennsylvania. So a bit of an oddity, but still well worth finding. And Moxie is probably as far as we can tell, it's the oldest continually bottled soda in the United States. It was bottled before, as I said, Dr. Pepper, Coke, or Pepsi. Hires is older, but Hires wasn't a bottler. Hires sold you the packets to do it at home. I even go as far as to say that Moxie may be the oldest continually bottled carbonated beverage in the world. Because who's older than Moxie? Well, it's like Schweppes, which started in the 1700s. But Schweppes moved from Geneva to London, and during World War II, what was happening in London? They were being bombed. And so Schweppes did not bottle during those war years, whatever. Moxie never stopped the bottling. Moxie had its headaches because it wasn't particularly well managed many years and sort of shot itself in the foot, many times, and that's a whole story in itself. But it's been continually bottled, even with COVID and some of the problems with getting concentrate, which is actually made in Puerto Rico, and getting the cans, which everybody wanted cans during COVID, because we weren't going to bars and restaurants anymore. We were staying home, so we were buying more things in containers, specifically cans, so that became a shortage. Well, thank you for coming. I encourage you to, both my book, Granite Fizz, is here in the bookstore, sold for the benefit of the MHA here for the Millyard Museum, so proceeds go for that. They also carry the book that Merrill and I came up with in 2019, Moxie. This is an Arcadia publication, and that's also there. That not only benefits the museum here, but any royalty proceeds are dedicated to the Matthew Museum in Maine. So Merrill and I don't get a cent from it. It all goes to the operation of that museum in Maine. As I said, also, I'm going to be speaking in Goffstown here in September on the whole topic of Moxie, so if you're interested. But if you haven't been to the exhibit, you really want to spend a few minutes at least perusing it. The staff here has done a great job putting that together, telling the whole story, a wider story than just this, of bottling and the bottling history and the fortunes to be made and fortunes to be lost, whatever, here in our own city of Manchester. So thank you for coming today. Sure, you entertain any questions, or if you have comments or stories to share.